Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
Let me put it this way. If it is the case that you should be punished for suggesting novel case and legal theories, or even challenging precedent, challenging the law on the books, which John didn't do because there was very little law on the books. But if you were able to punish people for that, then how could Brown versus Board of Education have ever been litigated? Why didn't Southerners prosecute Thurgood Marshall or disbar him for saying, I think all of the existing law here in these states, approved by the Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson, is wrong? I mean, he was fighting uphill far more than I think John Eastman was. And yet, we did do that to the people during the Civil Rights Movement. We allowed them to make the broadest arguments possible, to actually demand a change in the existing law, settled precedent of decades and decades there. So I think this is unfortunately people using the law to try to punish their political enemies.
Hello, and welcome to the special Indictment Palooza episode of the Roundtable. We promised you a special edition on all the Trump indictments, and this week we are very lucky to be joined by Professor John Yoo to help us talk through all of this. Professor Yoo is a professor at Berkeley Law. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution of Stanford University, and a longtime friend of the Claremont Institute in various capacities. He's written for the Claremont Review of Books. He's a recurring faculty member at our fellowships, and he's got a book coming out, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Supreme Court, along with Robert Delahunty, which is actually already out, so you can get that on Amazon. And he is here to help us talk through the innumerable twists and turns of the Trump indictments. We are recording this, for those that are interested, before the presidential debates, the Republican debates. So you'll get our analysis of that next week, next time. And for now, we're just going to drill down into, I'm sure I'm going to miss something here. And John, you can tell me what I've missed as I try to run through all of the various charges. There's 4 of them as I count them. There's the Washington grand jury charging Trump with conspiracy to disenfranchise Americans. This is the January 6th one at the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia. There's the classified documents case led by special counsel Jack Smith and federal prosecutors charging Trump with taking documents, withholding them from the government at Mar-a-Lago. And that's at the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Florida, with a trial date set for May 20th, 2024. There's the Georgia case. District Attorney Fani Willis presenting the grand jury with an indictment accusing Trump of trying to get Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger to find him extra votes. That's at the Georgia State Court. And Finally, there's the hush money case. The Manhattan grand jury indicted Trump for reimbursing his lawyer, Michael Cohen, who had allegedly paid hush money to Stormy Daniels in 2016 in the run-up to the election. That's in the New York State Court, and there's a trial scheduled for March 25th, 2024. That's a mouthful. Professor Yoo, John, did I miss anything? And just to kick things off here, would you tell us what you think among those various charges, where you think Trump's biggest challenges, biggest threat might be of actually getting nailed on one of these counts?
It's great to be with you guys. I think this is the first time I've been on the podcast, but I listen to it all the time. And I'm sorry my voice does not match the rich baritone soothing tone of the host. That was great. Thank you for the introduction.
It's a pleasure to have you. And we do exclusively actually lower the pitch of everybody's voice in this podcast. So we'll edit it in post. Don't worry.
You missed my most important role, which is in the various Claremont Institute programs. I am the loyal opposition, because I love talking about all this stuff with you guys, but I just still don't get it. I still don't get this Jaffa guy, and I barely get Strauss. This is very exciting. So if all first you got all the prosecutions that have been filed, there's still possibly more to come. There are other investigations going on in other states, but I think of the four, the way to consider it is the probability of getting convicted versus times the worst thing that could happen.
Hmm.
This is what you call expected harm. So I think of the four cases, the one that poses the steepest chance of at getting an actual conviction, I think, is the Mar-a-Lago classified documents case.
Okay.
On the
Interesting.
other hand, I can't imagine, given cases in the past like this, although it's extremely unusual, I'd be surprised if President Trump ever were to serve any kind of jail time for something like that. And I don't think the public interest is that important in that case. The one I think that is of the greatest public interest, though, if the allegations are true, is the special counsel's case out of January 6th. But I think that has the lowest chance of conviction
Hmm.
because I think the charges that have been filed by the special prosecutor, which are more like white collar crimes you see in businesses or securities fraud, uh, I don't think really fit the claim that Trump tried to stop the peaceful transfer of power. And then I think of the other two you mentioned, the New York City case that's really about, I don't know, bookkeeping and accounting, monkey business. There's a lot of problems with that one. That's one really not to be taken seriously. And then the Georgia case, which was the most recently filed, is so sprawling and yet so, how do you put it, so undefined actually in what happened and depends on such a far reaching claim that politics can essentially become the fodder for criminal cases. I think the Georgia one in the end might not come to a successful conclusion for the prosecutors.
That's very interesting. So, in other words, the January 6th indictment case is the one that really, if it's brought to conclusion, that one has the kind of greatest weight, as it were, against Trump. But there are, it sounds like some complications with it. I wanted to ask specifically about that case. Actually, as an expert in the law, there's a dimension of it that has to do with what lawyers themselves can and can't be charged for. John Eastman and Jenna Ellis and a number of others are kind of implicated in some of these cases. And one of the concerns that I've heard raised is, well, if you can't make an argument in defense of your client, no matter how spurious that argument may be, how far reaching can these accusations really become? What's the validity of that concern in your estimation?
Well, just in the interest of full disclosure, John Eastman is a friend of mine, and I'm being called to testify as an expert witness in his behalf in these California bar proceedings, which I similarly think are outrageous. But you'll see that John and some other lawyers are unindicted co-conspirators in the federal January 6th charges, and then they're actually indicted in Georgia. And I know John just presented himself for arrest and arraignment earlier this week in the Georgia state case. Here's the problem, and this is why I was suggesting earlier that what's happening here is a criminalization of politics, is because this is an area with no judicial precedents. This is an area where this has really only happened once before in our history, the 1876 election, where you have disputes over how the election's carried out. You have disputes about who the actual electors are. Uh, Whether you agree with the claims that President Trump has made about fraud or not, it seems to me that as a candidate, you have the right to explore all options that you might want to take. And some of them that John presented were, I disagree with some, I actually agree with others, but they're well within the range of what you could read or propose from the Constitution. Unfortunately, the Constitution is vague, if not just completely blank, about what to do when you have a dispute over electoral votes. If you read the 12th Amendment, it doesn't really tell you what to do in the case of an 1876 election where you have disorder in state governments and two bodies send two different slates of electors. And so it seems to me that if authorities go after lawyers for providing different options to the candidates and to the officials in charge of counting, verifying and counting the electoral votes, you're preventing people from engaging in politics. And let me put it this way: if it is the case that you should be punished for suggesting novel case and legal theories or even challenging precedent, challenging the law on the books, which John didn't do because there was very little law on the books. But if you were able to punish people for that, then how could Brown versus Board of Education have ever been litigated? Why didn't Southerners prosecute Thurgood Marshall or disbar him for saying, I think all of the existing law here in these states, so, approved by the Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson, is wrong? I mean, he was fighting uphill far more than I think John Eastman was. And yet, we didn't do that to the people during the civil rights movement. We allowed them to make the broadest arguments possible, to actually demand a change in the existing law, settled precedent of decades and decades there. So I think this is unfortunately people using the law to try to punish their political enemies.
What chance do you think there is that any of these cases might just be thrown out before they even get to trial? Could that happen?
I could see the New York City case being thrown out because it depends on this very tricky effort to get around what we call the statute of limitations in the law, which is you in the law, if some event happens, the government only has a certain number of years to bring a case. And so the actual facts of what happened, right? This is about whether Trump actually had money paid to women he'd had affairs with, and then whether these were properly accounted for in the corporate books of the Trump organization. Right? This happened years and years ago, and before the 2016 inauguration. And so, that's 7 years ago. And so the case is really outside the normal statute of limitations in New York. The DA there is trying to bootstrap that into some other claims to try to extend it. I'm not sure that's going to work. That could easily get thrown out. The Mar-a-Lago case, I think, the other reason I think is the biggest threat to Trump is that we could know about that very quickly because that originally started as a classified information case, but I think what it's really become is an obstruction of justice case because I think what the special counsel is going to do is place the case really around whether Trump and his aides tried to stop the FBI from finding about the classified documents. That could be done pretty quickly. I doubt that one's going to get thrown out. The Georgia and the January 6th special counsel cases, numbers 3 and 4, if you want to think about the timing, those are the ones I think that could be kicked out on the law. That'll be really before you even really need to have a trial. So, for example, to run through the federal January 6th case brought by special counsel Jack Smith, he alleges, for example, that Trump committed fraud against the United States. This is a this is a kind of charge that's usually used for defense contractors who overcharge for something or Medicare, Medicaid providers who, make up false operations or false procedures. The idea that you would use it for someone who wasn't trying to steal any money or property, right, but was trying to pursue their right, political options. That's unprecedented. In fact, the Supreme Court just this year said that the federal government is not to use fraud statutes to try to police politics. The Supreme Court, just a few weeks ago, overturned two convictions of Andrew Cuomo's aides for basically taking bribes who were charged under this fraud statute. So I could see that being thrown out. Another charge the special counsel's brought is obstruction of Congress. I could see that charge being used against people actually entered the House floor and tried to stop the electoral vote. That would be obstructing Congress from its duties. But I don't see the facts for Trump having done that. I mean, in fact, if there are facts about that, then I would say, let's see them and bring them forward. But the indictment doesn't list anything that connects Trump actually to the actual riots. You don't see the charges that you would think from listening to the rhetoric coming out of the government would be justified. You don't see a charge for insurrection. You don't see a charge for sedition. You see these white collar crime charges. Oh, and the last charge, which I could also easily see being thrown out just on the law without regard to any trial. The third charge is that Trump engaged in the deprivation of civil rights of voters. This is based on a 40-year-old precedent that said people who stuff the ballot box have essentially taken away all the civil rights of the voters in that state by diluting the force of their vote. Now, obviously, that's very different than here. Trump is not accused of, stuffing the ballot box or destroying votes. If anything, he was trying to appeal to state legislatures to take back their constitutional power to choose the electors, regardless of what the votes showed. I have a hard time seeing the Supreme Court buying that one, that expansion of that idea and applying it to the Trump case too. So I hope I'm sorry if I'm going on too long, but I think the special counsel prosecution has a lot of serious legal problems that have nothing to do with any facts you're going to prove at trial.
John, I wanted to ask you about so Congress, of course, has revised the Electoral Count Act after all this business. Isn't that proof that it just backs up your claim that John Eastman, our friend and colleagues, some of us, was well within the sort of acceptable range of constitutional, precedential, maneuvering and opinion and advice?
I think that's a good point, Ryan. I think the amendments to the Electoral Count Act after the 2020 elections are significant for two reasons. One is everyone admits the act was unclear, and if Congress had to amend the act to clarify it, you're right. That reaffirms that the act was unclear in 2020 and actually the years before. So that's one. The second thing is, and this is the deeper point, which I don't think John strongly made at the time, but I make this argument in an article I just published with Robert Delahunty a few months ago in Case Western Law Review, is that I'm not sure the Electoral Count Act is constitutional. Uh, if it is the job of the vice president to not just open the electoral the electoral votes, but also figure out which ones are the correct ballots, if he's got two sets, for example, then Congress can't take that power away by statute and just declare, oh no, we're going to assume the power to decide the legitimacy of the elector votes. And the reason we make that argument is because one thing that's clear from the founding, despite all the changes and amendments that were made to the selection of the president, the one thing that the founders were clear on is that they did not want Congress to choose the president. They rejected national popular vote of the president. They also rejected Congress picking the president. And even under the original Constitution and the 12th Amendment, when no one wins a majority of the electoral vote and it goes to the House, even there, the founders said, when it goes to the House, the House votes by state delegations. Again, to reinforce that it's not the House picking, it's the states picking the president. And again, as we all know, under the Electoral College, again, it's not the House picking, it's the states pick. Of course, they get votes based on proportion to the population, but it's still the state legislatures that formally pick the electors. And so to me, those structural and historical reasons point to the idea is if there were a dispute over electoral votes and the founders had created a mechanism, which I think they barely did, but when they create this mechanism of opening the ballots and deciding which ones were valid, I do not think they would have said, "Oh, Congress gets to decide," because then right, Congress effectively would assume the power to decide who's the president. Then we make a lot of other subsidiary arguments in there. For example, there are other cases where Congress does get to count disputed, and people just ignore these provisions. For example, if there's a dispute over a congressional election, the Constitution actually says Congress gets to decide. And so the founders actually knew how to say when they wanted to, if there's a problem with the election, Congress decides it. And they did not do that with the presidency. So I would even in a way have gone farther than John in saying the electoral count, I think, is unconstitutional. Which I think, John, if you go back and look at 2020, what John did is he tried to work within it, but also to work in areas where it was silent. And so but go back to your original point. For that reason, I don't think that John could be accused of unprofessional conduct, if you want to use what I call the Thurgood Marshall standard, and to use a criminal justice system to go after lawyers. I think again really threatens our ability to use politics rather than criminal law to choose our leaders and to make policy.
And there's also, isn't there, a mens rea issue here? And correct me if I'm wrong. I've had a little bit of trouble understanding the several layers to which the accusations go, but it seems as if in order for these charges to be valid, you not only have to posit that John and the other lawyers involved here were wrong, that they had the wrong argument, but that they were in some sense deceitful or fraudulent, that they were intending to maneuver dishonestly around. I mean, not again, it's unclear to me where the line between that and normal lawyering actually is. But even if there is such a line, is it the case that you'd need to show that Eastman and others crossed it?
Well, this is hard. There's two different states of mind here. There's a state of mind of Trump, the client,
Hmm.
and the state of mind of the lawyer. Trump, the client, is easier in a way because Trump has, I think, for some of these crimes, particularly January 6 ones, I think the prosecutors have to show that Trump knew that he had lost the election and was therefore trying to engage in fraud
Right.
by trying to get people to change their minds or change the electoral votes or whatever. But that's easier to understand. Right? That if Trump relies on the legal counsel he's getting and he believes that he won the election, then is he really committing fraud? I mean, you could still say someone did, but you just have to basically show that all the facts to a reasonable person, that no reasonable person based on the facts that they saw would believe they had won the election. So that's one kind of state of mind that's going on here.
Right, which would involve an enormous swath of the electorate also being unreasonable. Right, I mean, in order for that to be an unreasonable position, you have to condemn any number of just regular voters as well.
Yeah, I mean that would be actually you could try if you're the lawyer, you might try throwing that in to show, right?
Sure.
Like what would a reasonable person think, faced with the facts they saw after the election. Um, and then there's the lawyer state of mind, and that goes more to do you think that what John did is just outside the bounds of right what a lawyer would do, within the bounds of the profession. That is very hard to define. In this case, I think law is more of an uh, art than a science,
Hmm.
and that I couldn't give you a very straight, obvious, clear definition of where that line exactly is. So when I think of how to define it, I think of examples, defense attorneys, for example, particularly criminal defense attorneys who are paid for by the government for clients who can't afford counsel. Many of them will make legal arguments they know are going to lose.
Right.
Right? Many of them
Exactly.
know that especially if they're defending their clients on appeal. I have seen lots of cases where lawyers are raising arguments that have never won, that have always been rejected, that have no chance of success. Yet to zealously represent their clients, they make them. Think of Thurgood Marshall, and I think of the brave civil rights movement attorneys. They made arguments that said overturn the law, overturn this. I think horrible system defended by the law that you've built up for 60 years, overthrow all of it. I'm glad they did that. But if we had this narrow view of what lawyers are allowed to make, could Southern bars have disbarred Thurgood Marshall
Mhm.
and the other NAACP Inc. attorneys who, systematically over years in many states brought forward the cases that eventually led to Brown versus Board of Education and thankfully the overturning of Plessy versus Ferguson.
John, I just want to zoom out a little bit here. We talked about the criminalization of politics. On the flip side is the politicization of the law. So I think one of the most dangerous things about what's going on with all this stuff is when you're attacking an opponent politically, you got to come out publicly before voters. You got to tell them what you want to do. You got to tell them what your goals are. And then you solicit their support on that basis. If you're going after a political opponent through the law, there's a transparency issue. You don't have to reveal your master plan to anyone. You don't have to submit your opinions and judgments to voters. You can carry on your plans very much behind closed doors, very much in secret. And so, on the face of it, there is, I guess, an argument that all that's going on here is our judicial system at work. To throw the book at Trump, see where the chips fall, and then let justice be done. I don't think very many people think that's actually what's going on. I think a lot of people are thinking, okay, they want to put Trump in jail, or like Gavin Newsom is trying to do, they want to get him off the ballot. They want to make it illegal to vote for Donald Trump in 2024. What do you think the end game is? What is it that this concerted effort is trying to achieve, or are they really just trying to get away with whatever they can?
I think we got caught off there, but I think the question is, what's the point of all this? Why are people using the criminal law in this unprecedented way? I mean, I hope we don't leave this podcast without recognizing how unprecedented it is to prosecute a former president. Until 2023, no former president had ever been prosecuted by any state or federal government, ever. Uh, as far as I know, no former president had ever been arrested, had to be arraigned before, ever. We used to have, I think, a tradition in politics, right, to let close the book on the past, let the elections decide what we think of past presidents, let history and the president's legacy tell us what we think, and then turn to the future. Uh, I think so. In part, I think why we've seen what we've seen is that we've seen a loss of our confidence in politics to settle matters, or at least on one side. Uh, One side, the anti-Trump side, wants to use criminal justice because they don't, I think, trust the political system to, uh, follow the norms that we have in the past. I think that's unfortunate. It's because we have, I think, lost faith in our institutions and the way we've done political business in the past that we're turning to the criminal justice system. So, in terms of what the goal is here, I agree with what you said at the end of the question that this is a kind of, and this is really exemplified by the Georgia indictment, which in a way is the most troubling of all the indictments. The Georgia indictment is a throw everything at the kitchen sink and see what sticks. The Georgia indictment is the one that really threatens the criminalization of politics because it says President Trump's reelection campaign was itself a criminal enterprise. If you look at the indictment, it says the first act of the criminal enterprise was election day when Trump gave a speech saying he won the election. Right? So does that mean Al Gore started off right a criminal enterprise when he refused to concede the election on election day 2000? I mean, this is right. So she claims the Fannie Willis, the DA for Fulton County, claims, oh, reelection campaign is itself a criminal enterprise, and then she tells the whole story of what happened in her view after election day all the way through January 6th. Doesn't really explain how all of those acts advance this alleged criminal enterprise, and hopes that it'll all work out a trial in some way. This is, I think, very much a let's see what works. We'll just accuse him of everything and see if anything sticks to him. Now, the problem with that is, our system, our government stretched the law when it started passing these racketeering and organized crime statutes because they were difficult. It was difficult to actually get at the leader of organized crime. Like in the Godfather, right? Remember Godfather 2, right? Remember the congressional hearings, and they're trying to prove Michael Corleone is at the top of this big crime family. And so I can't remember. I think his name is Chichi, right? The first guy that's at the congressional hearing. They're like, you know, he would say, "Oh, I got the order," and I would press the button on this guy and that guy, and then they said, you know, well, Mr. Chichi, did you ever meet or hear from Michael Corleone, the head of the family, to press the button, as you so colorfully put it? And he goes, nah, I never met him. I don't know him. And he goes, why not? He said, they got, what do you call them? Buffers. They've got buffers in between us. Right. So, and then, of course, when Frankie Pentangeli, the right hand guy who actually knows all this stuff, comes up to testify, he sees his brother in the audience sitting next to Michael Corleone. And he says, "Oh no, I just made all that stuff up." The in a way, RICO and these organized crime statutes try to get at that by saying you could have a criminal enterprise where just different acts of the enterprise, it might even be innocent, all go to running the criminal enterprise. And so we can charge people who participated, even at low levels, but in a way to show, to build towards getting the head of the crime organization. The problem is that the government usually proves, and we assume that that organization is criminal from the beginning, that its main purpose, the only reason it exists is to commit crime. Just like we would say a terrorist organization. Terrorist organization might say, "Oh, we run a website. We put articles on the website. It's our propaganda. It's protected by free speech." But we might say, "No, the whole thing is a terrorist organization." Think how different that is from what we're seeing here. You know, the re-election campaign is not a crime organization. Its only purpose is to exercise free speech rights. It's a First Amendment organization, pure
Yeah.
and simple. So to claim that it's a criminal organization from the start, I think that's a serious threat to our political system. But that's what you get when you say, okay, we're just going to start making stuff up. We're not going to act within the normal practices of prosecution or the Justice Department and just throw every kind of charge we could think of. And the second thing, the weird thing, the big, obvious gaping hole, which people don't mention, but then they don't charge Trump for the things they're saying he did. Obviously, what they're saying they did is he tried to stop the peaceful transfer of power on January 6th. Well, then charge him with it. Charge him with insurrection. Charge him with sedition. But they don't.
Hey, John, I was wondering, we published what I thought was sort of a novel argument yesterday. It's claiming that, especially the January 6th charges, that it falls under double jeopardy because since he was already impeached for all of this, the Constitution says that if you've been convicted in an impeachment, then the law courts can take up criminal charges, but there's no consideration once you've been acquitted. Do you see where this is going? Does that make any sense to you?
It's an interesting claim. I need to think about it more. My initial response is I don't think impeachment and the criminal justice system are supposed to right trigger double jeopardy on part of the other. And the only reason I say this is because, if I recall correctly, in the Federalist Papers, when Hamilton talks about the impeachment of a president, he goes to great lengths to say impeachment is not a criminal process. It is not a conviction on whether you actually committed a crime. And he says, if you've committed a crime, you can always be prosecuted after you've been impeached and removed from office. But that's just separate and different. Um, and the reason I also think that is because I also wouldn't want the criminal justice system and whatever it finds to have any precedential effect on impeachment. So, for example, I could see a president being convicted of something, but that can't be used, I think, by I would say, a member of the House of the Senators saying, you must impeach and remove this guy or this woman because of what the criminal justice system told us. So I'd have to read the article and think harder about it. But my initial response is just the two systems are separate and should not influence each other.
Okay.
On the other side of this, James raised, I think, an important question, which is kind of what's the end game if indeed these aren't ultimately fair and even-handed applications of our legal system, but an effort to pervert that system for political ends. The kind of anxiety that raises in me is, well, usually my hope would be, okay, so this is an illegitimate use of our legal system, and by the nature of that system, illegitimate uses will fail. That where they're supposed to be stopgaps, they're not supposed to be able to succeed. Um, and yet, at the end of the day, you come before a jury and you are relying not just on the enlightened judgment of somebody that knows the system well, but on the public and on the um, small c constitution more generally. And it strikes me that on that end of things too, on the judgment end of things, we've got a lot of decay and corruption to deal with. And so I guess I'm wondering, as we sit here and point out all of these flaws and problems with these cases, all of these injustices of which they're sort of guilty by their very nature, to what extent will any of that matter? How much confidence do you have in juries and in judges to manage this process fairly and respond fairly to these accusations?
See, this is why I'm the loyal opposition.
Yeah.
Because I know people like Claremont, at least in some of the writings I read in the CRB, and I used to debate our friend Angelo Codavia about
Yeah.
this all the time. I'm more the Michael Yeoman side of all
Mm.
this, and that I still have faith in our institutions. I still have faith that, uh, for example, if the January 6th charges get brought before a jury, that they might either in Georgia or Washington they might acquit, but that ultimately our appeals courts, that ultimately the Supreme Court would reject the use of the criminal law in this way to trying to use white collar crime ideas about how you regulate businesses to prevent them from defrauding, to prevent them from destroying evidence, that can't be twisted into general judicial and prosecutorial regulation of politics. That I think are so I still think our institutions have had a good track record in trying to keep criminal law out of politics. This is the stress test of all stress tests, though.
Yeah.
I mean, compare it to 1876. In 1876, essentially, we had a weird, though very strange and one of a kind, but we did have a political solution to how to handle election disputes. And I hope that our institutions realize that is the wiser course and to reject this idea that, oh, we can use criminal justice to regulate our political differences.
John, I wanted to talk a little bit about in the Georgia case. Just get your quick take on. So, partly at the center of this, of some of Fannie Willis's claims, are the fact that there was "quote unquote" fraudulent electors scheme or fake electors scheme. Could you just elaborate on that a little bit? I mean, part of it is that they wanted to meet in special legislative session. Part of the conspiracy charge, at least floating out there in the media, and then reading it through Willis's indictment, is that Rudy Giuliani and others convened a bunch of state legislatures across multiple states to submit new electoral slates that would go for Trump. As I understand it from some of the stuff that's leaked, the lawyers inside the Trump campaign who were in favor of this wanted to do it so that they could then have competing electors and maybe delay the proceedings as John recommended from Vice President Pence, so that state legislatures could then investigate. It's not necessarily that they wanted to just by sheer will replace Biden electors with Trump electors. But anyway, what do we make of this fake electors claim, and how does it relate to? Actually, we do have some, post-war precedent, at least one instance of Hawaii and the Kennedy election, et cetera. So, can you help us make sense of this?
Well, actually, we have two examples of this happening in the past. There was the For example, as you said, Hawaii basically counted. I mean, this is Hawaii. I mean, come on, they couldn't count, so they actually they counted the votes wrong, and so they realized they had given the electors to the wrong candidate. They eventually gave them for Richard Nixon. Then they miscounted the vote in their state, so they said, "Oh, we made a mistake. We're going to send electors for Kennedy." And interestingly, Nixon was vice president at the time, so he had to open those votes and actually count them and to let it slide. It's not just let it slide. He made the initial judgment that this was okay, that the second electoral votes were actually the legitimate ones. He could have said the first ones were
Yeah.
actually the legitimate ones. But interestingly, he decided, which helps at least John Eastman's argument. And then the 1876 election, you have several states that sent two slates of electors
Yeah.
to Washington because you had disputes between the governors and the state legislatures about who had won the elections in their states. And at a time, right, 1876 is interesting because this is a time when I would think, I would describe them as, revanchist Confederates tried to take over their southern governments again and to try to, suppress the votes of African Americans. And so sent their own electoral votes instead of, I think, the ones on behalf of the people, the Republicans who actually won, the Republican candidate who actually won in those states. So I think, again, this goes back partially to earlier question about state of mind. Um, Gosh, it seems to me if the electors are being chosen, and it sounds like some of them clearly believe this because they want it to be a backup in case the other slate of electors turned out to be illegitimate or flawed in some way, then right, they could say we're the real electors. Now, the other point is, as you say, there's this accusation. We'll see if it's proved. It's just an allegation right now that some people in the campaign only picked the electoral votes because they wanted to create a fake dispute to falsely claim the legitimacy, that their first slate were illegitimate. I think that just folds into the broader claim. How much did these people believe that the election was fraudulent overall? How much did they actually believe that Trump had won? If the prosecution can really prove that Giuliani or some of Trump's other aides in the reelection campaign really knew for a fact, that Trump had won and that all of this was just fraud, then this is just a small part of that. Right? But that's a much bigger, um, that's a much bigger undertaking that they have to accomplish. That you can't. I don't think that this one, piece about the electors really gets them there.
Right. And I don't know if you've looked at all this, but what's the crime with the fake electors in Georgia? I mean, is that against Georgia statute? Is she claiming that she's enforcing federal law under the Electoral Count Act? That's the murky part for me. I mean, she's got all these.
Sorry, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is I'm sorry I mentioned this. This is actually I had this interesting discussion with Richard Epstein, my co-host on our Law Talk podcast,
Yeah.
and he's much more. I think he's much less skeptical of the Georgia prosecution than I am. But he and I both laughed when we looked at the indictment. What Fannie Willis says, what law she says is violated by the false, what she calls the fake elector scheme, is the forgery statute in
Right.
Georgia. And this is funny because, as Richard pointed out, nobody said they were somebody else. I mean, they all signed their real names to the document. I mean,
Right.
there's not, I mean, they just, forgery is when you say you're somebody else. It's like you sign the name, I'm Fannie Willis and I'm an elector for so-and-so.
Right.
So, this is why the fallback for the Georgia case and why it's so dangerous is they're going to say, oh, the whole reelection campaign starting after election day was a criminal enterprise. Anything anybody did to help it was a crime.
Right.
We can get anybody who participated as being part of it. And then, because of the RICO law there, that's a mandatory 5 years in jail for anyone who's convicted. So that's what's so dangerous is that basically you're saying, oh, wow, anybody who was working for the Trump campaign in Georgia and didn't quit after election day could theoretically be prosecuted by the DA in Fulton County as part of this vast conspiracy, even though what they might have done is hard to prove as, say, forgery.
Right. Okay, yeah, that's clarifying. What are we to make of should we rethink the notion of elected district attorneys at the state level? I mean, it's clear that Fannie Willis is and it's also the case with Bragg in New York, right? I mean, they're catering to their political constituency, they're stoking or feeding their ambitions for higher office maybe. Uh, maybe elected DAs are not a great idea. What do you think?
So, the question is, what's the alternative? Would you
Right.
rather be,
Right.
appointed? Some people say, oh, let's have them appointed by the courts, or
Yeah.
make them lifetime civil servants or something. So, I don't have a problem with elected DAs. I think that's, think about it at the national level, we elect the president, and the president's in charge of prosecution. In a way, we have
Right.
elected prosecution even at the federal level. And it's our European peers that often have prosecutors who are not elected. And, we don't want to be like Europe
Yeah.
anyway.
We don't want deep state prosecutors, right? At least we can remove
Yeah.
them. Yeah.
So the question is really, and before, up until this year, prosecutors of federal and state, think about the tens of thousands of prosecutors have never brought charges against a former president. We had norms and self restraint that prevented prosecutors from doing things like this. So, unfortunately, it seems to me the only way you put the genie back in the bottle is through deterrence. It's going to take, I think, some red state elected DA to prosecute Hunter Biden or Joe Biden, even
Right.
to open up a similar prosecution of a Democrat politician to show, how do you like it when the shoe's on the other foot, in order to get both sides to return to the principle that we let politics handle
Yeah.
how we think of appointing and removing presidents.
Yeah. So in a way that you and I talked a little bit about this at John Marshall Fellowship a couple weeks ago, but from a game theory perspective, you answer tit with tat, and so in a way, going after their side is not vindictive or sliding us down the cycle. It might be actually the most prudential act to get them to realize that this is bad.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Think about what you could do. If I mean, I did used to work for the Justice Department. I can't help but think about all these Trump cases from the prosecutor's side in a way. That's why I regret that they didn't charge the proper crimes. But I'm thinking now, what if I were a prosecutor and I had this remit? Why not prosecute the Hillary Clinton campaign? I mean, what did they do? They took this Russia hoax, they paid for this made up dossier, and then they seeded it all through the intelligence agencies run by their, president of their own party to provoke a 2-year investigation into the
Right.
sitting president. Why isn't that a criminal enterprise?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Or you could say, what about Hunter and Joe Biden, who even before Biden's president engaged allegedly, it seems, in influence peddling with foreign countries,
Yeah.
including one of our great geopolitical rival, China. So, I mean, a DA, if there's a Republican elected DA in some county or
Mhm.
city in America where any aspect of the Hunter Biden case passed through, why can't they bring charges and say the whole Biden family was a criminal enterprise?
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I've been saying that they should find out if Jimmy Carter misused any Habitat for Humanity tools and drag him out of his deathbed, arraign
Yeah.
him.
Well, the Hunter case, John, is great because it looks a lot more like a traditional RICO case, as we're seeing increasingly with burner phones and buffers between the big guy and the rest.
Shell companies, multiple layers of bank accounts. I mean,
Yeah.
that's a conversation for another
Yeah.
podcast,
Yeah.
I'm sure.
Yeah, after your earlier thought experiment example, John, of a group of guys running an online magazine who were secretly involved in covert terrorist operations, I feel I need to issue a disclaimer at the end of this podcast that nothing we've said here is intended to advance our various mafia connections in other capacities. But this was great, John. Thank you very much. I feel like I've learned a lot. I really appreciate you taking the time. I know you're a busy guy, and thanks for being here.
Oh no, I really enjoyed it, and anytime I'm always up for coming back, and anytime I can do anything with the Claremont Institute, it's a great It's a great pleasure for me to debate my friends.
Terrific. Well, loyal opposition, John Yoo. Thanks very much for joining us, and thank you all for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to know more about all the stuff we do at Claremont, you can visit our various websites. AmericanMind.org is the one we run here on this show, but there's also Claremont Review of Books.com, about to come out with a new issue. I know I keep teasing this, but it really is heading to the printers. I think it's a great one. And you can donate to support everything we do at claremont.org/donate. That's including the publications, but also our fellowships that we run and all the other programs that we are working on as well. Check out our DC-based Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. And do not forget to subscribe to this podcast, because you will get a new episode every week. And it makes us happy when you give us a 5-star review. At the very, very least, please keep all your bad opinions and criticisms to yourself, and share the show around whenever you get a chance. That's it for us. Thanks to our production and engineering crew, Jake Gannon and Logan Zeppieri. And thanks to you all for listening. We will talk to you next week.